Imagine it's the 1920s. You're in New York City, you're in Harlem, and you're queuing for the Cotton Club, one of the most famous jazz clubs of all times, but you're not getting in because of the color of your skin. Bryan Carter gave this experience to many of his students and students of all skin colors, including white. And he did that using AR and VR. This matters to him partly because he is associate professor at the University of Arizona in Africana Studies, so experiential learning, but also because at the same university he is the director of the Center for Digital Humanities. So he is one of the pioneers about using AR, VR in education and beyond. I spoke with him about his project around the Harlem Renaissance, and I spoke with him about how it is for him to use Beem, to beam his classes into the living rooms of his students, and of course about the question, what does all of that tech do to us humans? Do we grow further apart, or can it create more connection? Hi, Bryan. Hey, thanks for finding time with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right, so you're at the University of Arizona and you're the Associate Professor in Africana Studies and Director of the Center for Digital Humanities.
That's
What are
correct.
digital humanities?
That's a great question. Well, digital humanities is a number of things. It's not just one, but it basically is where we in the humanities use a higher level of technology in our teaching and research, and we encourage our students to use higher levels of technology to express their understanding in whatever our courses happen to cover.
Higher levels of technology? Is that spaceships or
Um,
solutions that
I,
beam us
I,
to
guess,
other
I guess that
planets? What's
was I
higher
guess
tech?
that was I guess that was rather vague. Things like AR, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, text mining, GIS, mapping, spatial computing. I mean, all the things that are in the STEM fields and in computing, we apply in the humanities, and we are able to see our fields very differently and able to understand them very differently because of these tools.
When I had history classes back in the day, it was you get books. We had a professor who just read from a script that was already 20 years old, and once a year we watched a film. So how specifically do you use higher tech? Can you give an example?
That's a great example. That's a great question. Well, basically, being able to, let's say, for instance, one of the best ways to teach someone a language is to immerse them in that particular culture. Well, now imagine applying that to history, studying history. One of the best ways to learn history is to maybe take people back in time or take people to another location that either no longer exists or that will be able to accentuate whatever the point happens to be. So I teach Harlem Renaissance classes and African American literature. I thought, what better way to teach my students to be as excited about the Harlem Renaissance than to take them back in time?
So not everybody might know, what is the Harlem Renaissance?
That's a great question too. Well, the Harlem Renaissance is basically a period just after World War One, where jazz took off and where creative expression for African Americans was unbridled. That coupled with increased racism and lynchings in the United States, as well as the explosion of jazz in places like Paris and other locations overseas, it was a time for celebration, yet a time for extremes during the 1920s. This was a time of the Industrial Revolution in America, time of the Great Negro Migration. But really, it was running parallel of the Jazz Age.
So in a way, in Harlem at that time, these tensions, but also these positive energies somehow came together and expressed themselves culturally in clubs, in bars, in music.
Exactly. I mean, imagine the differences between being an entertainer or being an artist during that period and being celebrated, yet knowing that there are increased lynchings and segregation happening all over America. But yet this was an exciting time for Black creative expression because now these creative artists could use their art in order to express their dismay at that which was happening in America.
So that's the Harlem Renaissance or a part of the Harlem Renaissance. So how exactly did you explore that with your students, for your students using tech, AR and VR?
Right. So, well, the Harlem Renaissance is full of various forms of creative expression: music, art, literature, film, all kinds of things. And so, I automatically get excited when I teach this period because it was the first time that Black people were able to create the, to express themselves so creatively and have it be just consumed in so many different ways. And then, of course, I teach a class that takes students over to Paris once a year in connection with that particular period. But when I wanted to I get across to my students was that this was the most exciting period in American history. Well, sometimes students weren't quite as excited as I was, and so in order to increase that level of excitement, I thought, why don't I try to figure out a way to take them back in time? And it was at that exact moment that there was a call for professors and advanced graduate students at my former university, where I received my PhD. I was in a PhD program at the time, that wanted to have calls for projects that dealt with a brand new technology called virtual reality. This was back in 1996 or 97, and so VR was just beginning to make its way on campus. Universities were pouring, hundreds of thousands of dollars into this tech because it was supported by DARPA, and the JPL was, getting into VR and everything, and so it was really, really a hot field. Well, me and three other professors submitted proposals, and Harlem was mine, and it was picked up, and it took off from there.
How exactly did you then use AR, VR? What did students do, and then what did they see? How did you bring that period to life for them?
Sure. Well, at my university, we had a one-walled cave, and a cave unit is basically a room that is 10 by 10 square feet, where the walls are backlit video displays. So you stand within this room, and you're surrounded by an environment that where when one person wears a motion-tracked headset, the perspective changes based on where he or she happens to be looking, but the environment is in 3D because everyone is wearing active shutter glasses. So you're being led down the street by a user, and then everyone sees objects and cars and people in 3D passing by them. At my university, we had a one-walled version of this where people wore passive 3D glasses, very similar to the ones that we wear in movie theaters now. And one person would drive the experience, and we would all be able to experience Harlem in all of its depth. But we were able to incorporate something that you can't do as easily in the classroom, and that was the sounds, the digital stories, the experiences that we glean from articles or from personal essays or what have you. But now we contextualize them. So when we're walking down the street and we pass by an alley and we overhear a conversation between two men playing checkers about their trek from the south up to the north, we inadvertently learn about the Great Negro Migration. And there's so many other experiences that we ultimately created when we had the 3D environment, as we converted it to be experienced as a multi-user environment in the platform called Second Life, which is where we were able to design some very, very impactful experiences for students in this 3D world that they experienced together.
You remember you sharing during another conversation we had also a very touching moment where it's about getting into one of these clubs. What's the experience you created for your students there?
Yes, well, for about 10 or 12 years, I was a visiting professor at the Sorbonne, and my students at the Sorbonne collaborated with my students at the University of Central Missouri within this environment called Second Life. Time differences and everything, but they built some amazing stuff like a museum for Josephine Baker, Bricktop's Club in VR that people could go in and visit. But one of the things that the students in Paris really didn't understand was the level of racism in the United States and where that racism took place. I mean, because that wasn't really a thing that was really taught or discussed in the schools there. So my students here, we had already a version of the Cotton Club in our version of virtual Harlem. And so the
which
students
was
here,
one of the most or the most important club at the time.
yes, it was
Mhm.
one of the most popular clubs at the time. Yes, everyone who was anyone played at the Cotton Club. And so, but what students in Paris didn't understand is that African Americans couldn't go in the Cotton Club as patrons. And so, to get this point across, in Second Life, you can identify with whatever ethnic or gender you wanted. And so, we had students truthfully identify their ethnicity, but then wear these little badges that allowed them certain privileges based on that ethnic choice. So we took them on a field trip to the Cotton Club, and based on their ethnic choice, they either could or couldn't go in the front door. And that conversation we had afterwards with regards to them standing outside and hearing what was going on the inside, the fun that people were having, but then ushered in through the back door, it made them feel a certain way that they'd never felt before. And it was really quite an impactful experience for everyone.
And those students from Sorbonne, they could have been white, black, any race, and they chose a badge. They chose
Yes.
what they wanted to be in that other world, that virtual
Yes.
world. And then so a white person could get a glimpse of the sense of rejection that a black person.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So it was really, really quite interesting because the Cotton Club is one of those locations that, even though it was in the middle of an African American community, catered to an all white audience. And you really couldn't go in the front door as a patron. You could only be a waitress or waiter or an entertainer if you were black at the Cotton Club. And that was one of several locations in places like New York and Chicago and St. Louis, etc.
There is among many one similarity between the two of us that sticks out for me, which is we both teach. Now I do courses for public speaking, and in my experience, it makes a huge difference if you just give the concept, you need to modulate your voice, or if you give them a quote and then you try it out and you have an audience and you see really. So it's about experience in learning. What's your sense in terms of AR, VR? How much of a difference does it make?
Oh, experiential learning has been something I've been studying since my PhD program. That's what led me into digital humanities because that's where you can create these memorable, engaging, and experiential things that happen in the classroom, whether it be taking someone back in time and experiencing the Harlem Renaissance, or whether it be working with a group in the community that allows students to engage in responsible community engagement, but then what they're doing, say digitally, impacting a community in so many important ways. So I think that when I think about all the ways that these technologies really help reach people, not just students but also the community, I mean, you can't beat it.
You also used Beam for a couple of projects.
Uh,
What did you try out? What have you
Oh
done?
gosh, I love Beam. Beam is our next foray into really what's referred to as presence. When you think about virtual reality and you think about representing yourself as an avatar, typically, yes, we really have studied how when we have an avatar that looks like us, we tend to adopt it. It tends to adopt us, and we tend to adopt it with regards to its behaviors, the way that we represent ourselves professionally or socially within these virtual environments. That's why there's so much money spent in on clothing and the types of avatars that people want to represent themselves as. But one thing that a computer generated avatar has difficulty doing is accurately, of course, representing who we are. I mean, you can choose who we want to be, the idealistic us, but that's just not it in today's day and age, with so much focus on the metaverse and representation, accurate representation. We just got a grant about through maybe 2 years ago from Facebook that studied representation in virtual environments in professional settings. Because at that time, it was just before, maybe 3 years ago, just before COVID, there within virtual environments, there were so few equal representations of people of color that or people that had disabilities or whatever the case may be, other than the sort of standard white male or white female representation, and then variations of that. So when you think about representation, this is becoming something more and more crucial when we think about how important the metaverse is in, say, business or education, even entertainment. What Beam and other holographic or volumetric capture technologies do is that they allow you to record someone and have an accurate representation of who he or she is, and then broadcast that or make it available on demand anywhere. So the technology basically is holographic, and where by using a phone you can record a short recording that someone, when they scan a QR code, can res you right in their space, and you can also broadcast live, it's a perfect scenario for the next iteration of interactivity within the digital humanities. I'm using it in my classes and projects, everything. I love it.
Can you give an example for a project where you're using that?
Yes, yes. So, in projects, I'm having students work with a local museum, and they've recorded curators who are talking about different exhibits within that museum. However, based on the audience that comes through, the curators could possibly relate to that audience a little bit differently. So, for instance, the museum has a fantastic series of exhibits on the Native American presence in the Southwest. Now, that's going to come off a little bit differently if the curator is, say, a white male versus a Native American female talking to a particular demographic. And so that's one example. I'm also using it in classes, which I love. Oh my gosh, and my students love it too. That's where at the beginning of class, the students, I have a slide deck. It's an online course. The first slide is a QR code. The students scan the QR code and they place me right in their room. And then based on the technology, I can control the keynote presentation. And so it's like I'm right there in their space. So the presence that we create, that Beam has done, is the exact same thing that all these video conferencing platforms are trying to do with creating like an arena or something that feels like you're sitting next to someone, but you're watching them on a television screen.
So what I heard from you is for your online lectures, rather than just like we do a Zoom call and everything. No, I would have you on my device, and I could beam you on this table or on that
Yes.
sofa over there, and then follow the lecture with you appearing to be my private space.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. We're so
What's the
excited about
feedback?
that.
I mean, you love it. Apparently, what's the feedback from your students? What are
The
they
students love it.
telling you?
They love the interaction, and they can't wait to find out what the next iterations of this be will be. Because you can imagine that you start off with one smaller things. When I first started with video conferencing, the video windows were 320 by 240, right? And now look at them. So you can imagine that we're just at the cusp of where this technology is and where I think it's going to go. So right now we've got a talking body, and we've got two-way audio communication. But now imagine where we can now volumetrically capture a space, and that talking body is pointing students to navigate through their real space, but yet being able to maybe approach a virtual work of art or sculpture, or maybe watch a slide deck from within that augmented environment. When wearables come on to play, we've got a pair of the Magic Leap 2 headsets and some of these other wearables. When wearables become more ubiquitous, students won't even have to hold up a phone. They can scan a code with their glasses, and they've got their teacher standing right there. So this is where we're going, and it's so exciting because I know that with the evolution of technology, we're really going to take things in a new direction.
So this is for the next years, hopefully to come. If we go back to the here and now, you said you use Beam, for example, for your lectures. What else is Beam useful for in your environment?
Oh, yes. Well, Beam is always useful for presentations. I've done keynote presentations with these already. One was a 20-minute keynote where I was here, and I couldn't be there, but there was someone else there that had an iPad connected to a data projector, and they simply projected my presence onto the stage. And not only did the keynote happen, but people were able to ask my hologram various questions, which was really cool for them. And because the keynote was on Afrofuturism, it was an example of experiencing Afrofuturism, which was really kind of an interesting side note to the whole presentation.
You're a pioneer in many different ways, and very particularly use of tech for humanities. When you look around and see what other professors, teachers are doing. What needs to happen for them to catch the bug, to really want this?
Well, that's part of what the Center for Digital Humanities does. We work with faculty, professors on and off campus, organizations, museums, galleries, cultural centers, and we help them with incorporating the appropriate technology into their classes, their research, their programming, their whatever they're doing with regards to exhibitions, anything like that. And we consult with them. We get them involved in the creative process as much as they want. Part of the mission of the center is faculty development. When I was a junior professor and I would get a grant, I would have to find people to develop that for me, and then I'd usually just get back a finished product. I had no idea how it was developed or anything like that. So we've solved that with regards to inviting professors in so they can learn as much of, say, the code or whatever that platform was, so they can understand how their own project was developed, so they can write about it, talk about it, propose about it more effectively.
With all of these opportunities, you still need goggles or computer, a powerful broadband connection. And the reality is not everybody has this. Is AR, VR currently a privilege for those that are already well off?
It is very much privileged. We see that from the price. We also see that from having the requirement of all the things that you just mentioned with regards to broadband access. We're working on something really exciting here at the center that just was approved about a month ago, and that is a huge broadband initiative that's sponsored by the National Telecommunications Association department here by the U.S. government. It's a $3 million grant that expands and extends broadband access to underserved areas in and around the University of Missouri, I'm sorry, the University of Arizona campus and its micro campuses. So we have four partners, Douglas, Pasquayaki, Yuma, Thatcher, and at those locations we have micro campus sites. And because they're so far from the university, we have a difficult time having those students take STEM courses. So we'll be able to deliver very impactful, high speed, and innovatively created STEM courses over that high speed network, along with being able to create technology kits that can be distributed to students that are from lower income brackets. And they can keep, I didn't tell you this before, they can keep those their entire college career. All they have to do is demonstrate that they're registered for the classes in the following semester. So it eliminates access with regards to broadband as well as computing. Then the last stage of the project is going to be a series of short courses on workforce development, financial literacy, creative and productivity development short courses. So people in communities that don't have access to those tools and those things will be able to go to a community center and learn them free of charge using the most innovative technologies like AR and VR and MR. So when you think about how people in various communities don't have access or don't have the privilege to have some of the technologies that we have at the university, well, here's where we're trying to bridge that gap, not only with regards to broadband access, but also the equipment and the knowledge to empower those communities, which is really, really something that's a part of the mission of our center.
Like with any new tech, it's the same two questions. What do we do with it? And who is we, as in who gets to work with it? And what I pick up from our conversation is, oh, let's go into the topics that really deserve us, where we as societies need to learn. And let's make sure as many people as possible get the privilege of using it so that it's no longer a privilege.
Yes, because oh my gosh, there's a novel that I love to point out that exemplifies this, and it's one by Neil Stevenson called Diamond Age. And Diamond Age is about this inventor that works for the rich and famous, the privileged class, and he invents this primer for his daughter. And this primer is like a book that has all the knowledge in the world. Okay, this was written back in the late '90s, but this book has all this knowledge in it, right? And so and and the primer falls into the wrong hands. It falls into others' hands because it's stolen. And so, as a result of it being stolen and then distributed and replicated on the black market, all of these underserved classes now have access to all this knowledge. And there's this uprising from the people, with regards to them, becoming more aware, and more knowledgeable and more empowered. It's really, really a good novel, but it's exactly what we're doing here. Imagine the impact that this is going to have on communities that before couldn't take certain kinds of classes or didn't know about AI or never experienced VR, and now they can imagine how they can create small businesses or maybe become more competitive in the workforce. It's going to be a transformative.
Yeah, because today, if you want to build your business, it helps if you have had models in your life and then you Google them, but it's still complex process to go to these programs to assume it's for me and it's maybe schooly and you may not have formal education. What if it's easy and it's beamed into your space? Opportunities right here in the way you
Yes.
need it.
Yes, and Beam. It's so funny because by delivering these using these innovative tools, it's not like someone is sitting in front of a computer monitor. That may not be their learning style, but now being able to show them how to bring an individual, a teacher, into their space, or maybe some VR objects or AR objects into their space to manipulate. That's a whole different thing, and I think Beam is going to be right there at the cusp of it.
Last thing, there is this worry as we use more tech, there's more distance between people. Look at those kids when I go on the tube here in London and they're all on their phones, they're not interacting. On the other hand, you and I, we wouldn't have met otherwise. So what's your take? Do we become more, big word, human or less human by using AR and VR?
Well, I think part of the strategy and the purpose of the digital humanities is to use these tools to understand the human condition differently, whether and hopefully apply these tools to make the human condition better in all respects, whether it be educationally, experientially, financially, all those things. And that's part of what we're studying is how these tools can affect of various communities. So by looking at it that way, and instead of looking at these tools as being competitors or that they're taking jobs away, it really gives us a different perspective. And I really do think that these tools can empower folks in ways that we just have not even imagined yet. It's really going to be an exciting year.
From experimental psychology, what makes us like people, there are two big drivers. One is similarity. Ah, you'll like me. The other is familiarity. I have a feeling for you. And if tech gives us more of that, if ARV or if Beam can help with that, then that's probably good news for Homo sapiens.
Couldn't agree with you more. The empathy that these technologies have a potential to generate, and if we start early and do it properly and do it responsibly, I think it's really going to have an impact on younger generations. It's going to just impact our society in ways that it's just so exciting.
Bryan, and still, I really want to meet you in person. I hope it will happen soon. Thank you so much for your time. I've learned a
Thank you.
ton from you.
Thank you
Thanks a
very much
lot.
for the opportunity. Take care.